I'd like to introduce Jason Providakes, the CEO of MITRE. We heard from Laura Naramore yesterday from MITRE a little bit about this FFRDC, Federally Funded Research and Development Corporation. By the way, I learned about FFRDCs originally from my good friend Mike Lippitz, who's right here, who brought me in on some programs with IDA, the Institute for Defense Analyses, back in the early 2000s. And it was a fascinating introduction to innovation within the government, in this case, the Department of Defense space. And I've never been the same since. So with that, Jason, if you'd join me on the stage. Thanks for being here. Let's go have a seat. And thanks again for MITRE's support. It's been a few years now that you and your organization have been supportive.
I've been sitting for the last hour standing, so
you want to stand and talk? Yeah, please. This is Ken. You know, we can even take our jackets off if you want, but don't go any further than that.
Where's Laura?
Great. So the theme, the audience knows a bit about MITRE, but if you could give us a thumbnail for anyone who's new with us today.
Yeah. So MITRE is a not-for-profit. You heard a lot about not-for-profits today. It's a 501c3. Those who are in the business school knows what that means. And what's interesting about MITRE is they've been around over 60 years. And I would summarize the mission in a few words, which is making the world safer and more secure. That's sort of been the fundamental mission context of the company. What that says more is the fact that we serve in the public interest, as most non-profits do. We are effectively a systems engineering technology company, applied science. It's not fundamental research, but it's applied science. And we bring it together in a way that brings communities together, which will bring us to this notion of trust. You can't bring communities together without having a high degree of trust and being trustworthy in doing that. So you bring this technology, you bring this applied science capability and system engineering to problems of national importance, and today of national scale, which means large-scale types of problems. And I would say it fundamentally started in the area of national security. Those who remember back in the 50s and 60s, the Cold War, and like what was happening, and building the first national air defense system for the country is what MITRE effectively did. And that knowledge and capability grew into other areas in the area of national defense through the 70s and 80s and the 90s, to include a lot of intelligence. And then what happened in the 2000s is all of a sudden government decided we had to modernize. We had to get smarter. How do we bring technology into government and make government more effective? And then that created a new set of classic problems of technology and IT, and then the company expanded further into those other areas of government, of modernization. And I'll talk later about areas like, healthcare and the like. And then what happened in the 2000 time frame, where the threats to the country became not so much just external, but internal. Of course, 9/11 is a classic example of that in the formation of the Department of Homeland Security and the like. So you got a company here that a large part is an area of national security, which gets to the part of making the world more secure. And then also this notion of making the world safer, because we also operate, you mentioned these federally funded research development centers for the FAA. And many of you may not feel this because it happens slowly, but if you think about safety in aviation safety, the United States is probably the only country in the world that's had fewer aviation disasters than any other country. And it's an amazing result if you think about it. Millions of flights occur every day, and literally, when the last time you heard about a significant large-scale aviation problem in the last decade? And that's a lot to do, and I'll talk about that a little bit, about the role of trust in making that happen in terms of making aviation safety important for the country.
Great. Thanks, Jason. Matt, you said something interesting. You bring communities together. What do you mean by communities? You're talking about communities of expertise, or what do you mean by communities around a challenge?
Right. So there's communities in government. So we operate a center inside MITRE called the Center for Connected Government. So many of the problems when I talk about national scale, if you just think about something in the area of healthcare, touch many different government agencies. which means you got to bring those government communities together to really tackle that problem of healthcare for the nation. If you're truly trying to create an integrated healthcare system, you got to touch state level organizations and local levels. Those are part of that community. So there are a set of stakeholders which you would bring together. Equally important, which you heard today in a previous talk, but it's extremely powerful, the growing role of the private sector and industry and the like in solving these problems. So again, what MITRE tries to do is bring industry together. We partner with certain industry organizations and bring them in as well as non-for-profits and the like. Trying to bring this together around a problem, and we can talk more about that later.
So your methodology is some similarities to the win-win notion that Vince is promulgating with private sector.
Right.
Interesting. So give us an example of one of the grand challenges that MITRE is working on or has worked on, one that you can share, and an idea of how you approach something.
Yeah. So let's go back and talk about the aviation one for a moment, right? So why is it safer today when we're flying? And what MITRE did, working with the FAA sponsor, was create what's called the Aviation Safety Information Analytics Sharing Center, for short, SIAS. You know, we love acronyms, FFRDCs, SIAS, but basically it's fundamentally sharing information, applying analytics to it, and from that extracting that knowledge in the area, in this case, safety. And what makes that unique, and in the context of this discussion about trust, to make it real, you had to get data sources from all the airline industry components. Airlines, for one, you know, United and the like, are they going to share their, quote, early safety data? Yeah. Your misses, what's happening, maintenance and the like. Unions have to share information. Controllers share information. And all of them, of course, are sitting going, oh, we're going to share this with the government, FAA, oh my God, regulation, right? How's that going to work? And then the FAA has a lot of data. What we created was a trusted broker, being this company, who was independent, not-for-profit. Look, share us your data sources. We'll take this in, we'll look at it, and what we will do, since we all agree safety is paramount in the industry, we will share back with you what we see in a way that doesn't point out that says, oh, airline, you're doing something really bad, we're going to make the world know it. We're going to just share you, airline, if we see something in terms of predictive nature, you should really look at it because we think it might lead to an accident. Or we're seeing a lot of near misses. For why is that happening?
So you give them an early warning, a buffer against finding out the hard way, or against the regulator coming in and saying, hey, you're missing something.
Right, because we're on it together.
Right.
See, government, FAA didn't want to create new regulations. Look, if the industry can self-police itself.
Please do.
Yeah, and it's a very powerful construct. So SIAS over the last decade has become, again, this trusted entity where you have information sharing, and how you do becomes very important, right? You got to protect a lot of sensitive data. You got to create a platform around it. There's technology involved in doing this. And then do the analytics around it, and then figure out, how do I share this sensitive information to the world? I can create a score for airlines. And so look, we've discovered the average safety score is 4. And then provide every single airline and entity their own number privately. So looking at it, going, gee, the average is 4, and yet we're 3. You might want to look into that. Or we're 4.5. Hey, that's pretty good. What can we do more to improve it further? So by creating a business model with each of the trusted parties, you can actually get the entire community to come together to raise that level of safety. So that's one area. And there are others we've done in healthcare and the like.
That's interesting. That's a proxy, actually, for many other industries. Obviously, aviation throws off a lot of data, but increasingly every industry will be throwing off a lot of data. And then the question is, do you really want that single for-profit company, really anywhere, headquartered anywhere in the world, to own all of my data, whatever that means? We're already having a lot of these public dialogues right now about the challenges, the benefits and the downsides. So maybe we'll see a proliferation of more, not necessarily MITRE, but the kind of model you're talking about, where there's trusted third-party entities, and everyone says, okay, I'm willing to provide those.
What's interesting about the trusted third-party entity construct, if you're going to build a public-private partnership, remember the government has lots of sensitive data. If I'm sitting over here in the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, am I going to provide public data to some entity? Right. How are they going to use it? Yeah. Are they going to use it for public good? Are they going to use it for profit? So coming up with the model of that works, that brings, quote, communities together to solve a common problem has been a challenge. What we've been looking at is not not-for-profits obviously have a powerful role, because in theory, they have less vested, they're more objective and independent. But there are for-profit entities out there that you could construct, perhaps, that they themselves could be this broker, and they create a business model to ensure that, look, we're not going to compete against our fellow entities in the business space, we're going to firewall it off. And you have to do something to make it viable, because if you just leave it to just not-for-profits, again, we're limiting. There are lots of problems out there at varying scales that you would love to build these sort of public-private partnerships, even at the local level, city local.
Great. So let's shift now to this question of foresight. And after all, that's the word there up on the screen.
Yeah.
So what does foresight mean in MITRE's context?
Well, in our case, if you've been around for 60 plus years, it's really looking into the future. The fundamental role of a FFRDC is research and development. And a lot of that has to be is look into the future. What the government sponsors want from their federally funded research development entities is tell us what we should be seeing down the road. Help us think about the future. How do we prepare for the future? So for a company like MITRE, it's really important that we stop. We just don't look tactically, but we look out there into the future and see what's emerging, types of problems.
But Jason, why? So, by the way, I think the model is really interesting, and I see a lot of value in it. But presumably, government could say, okay, our core teams are focused on the present, the current issues, the dealing with Congress and serving constituents and all this. But you know what? Let's put some money aside and have some people do the long thinking inside the entity. Couldn't they have done that? Why is it better in your structure? By the way, this is a question relevant for all of our organizations, especially large corporations. Couldn't they have just done it themselves?
It's like a lot of companies, they create skunk works.
Yeah.
If you're going to transform and you're trying to do something, if you ask the organization that's doing the near fight daily, and trust me, if you're in government, it's a daily firefight every single day. Very hard to get senior thinkers and the like to break away and think about the long type of topic. It's just almost impossible. So the creation of these federally funded research development at least provided a way so that we're going to farm off some of our resource, and you guys think about the hard problems that are facing our nation and come back to us, help us think through those as we go forward. So it became a very powerful construct, not the only one.
Yeah.
What you're seeing even today, the government going to Silicon Valley and the like, particularly the Department of Defense, and asking for help and saying, look, you guys are thinking about the future. Help us think about and see the future. Right. So I think you need to get outside. Any transformation has to occur by going to the outside and trying to get those thinkers to think differently about the problems.
So let's transition then to trust, which will bring us to Kent Grayson, my colleague here at Kellogg, who will be on next. You mentioned it already a couple of times, came up yesterday a few times. What does trust mean within these hard systems engineering problems, these creations of communities, et cetera? What does trust mean for national security?
Well, you got to create, in our case, trusted systems. This become really important. So there's the machine dimension and there's the human dimension to trust in many ways. So in the machine dimension, obviously, we are creating very complex systems, and the components of those complex systems themselves have to be trusted in some sense. You have to have confidence in them. They're going to do certain things. But what's interesting about trust in our space, when you also then inject the human dimension into it, then you end up with complexity to that. So one of our challenges is how do you create trusted systems, which includes both IT, machines, and humans in a way that creates confidence and reliance on that this is going to work going forward. So it's been a challenge with us. Also, if you're an FFRDC and you want to have a trusted conversation with the sponsor, that's another dimension of trust, right? That's the human dimension of trust, that I am going to sit with the sponsor and they're going to share with me their most, craziest secrets and their problems and the like, which you need to have to put things in context, because I use that trusted information in a way that helps us come up with solutions which actually are executable. Because if I don't know something that says, look, I just heard something from my boss, they're going down this path, and if I bring them an answer on a different path, it's just not going to work very well. So navigating, that trusted relationship in a way that also provides, let's say, the brutal truth or truth to power, as we talked about sometimes. You hear a lot about in the media today, loyalty versus honesty. All right, FFRDCs aren't loyal entities. They're honest entities. They were designed that way, to be that way, to give the brutal truth sometimes, but really truth to power in the context that says, look, we're telling the government, because we're in to serve the public interest, that this is not going to work the way you are, this policy is dead on arrival and the like, and here's why. These are the changes you need to make.
It's an interesting place to be because being honest can also be dangerous.
Oh yeah. I've testified several times on the Hill.
So, Jason, we're pleased that you have an honest entity working with our government, bringing communities together. It's an interesting challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say in some ways it's very consistent with how you were founded years and years ago, but in other ways it's evolved significantly. It's rather different than where you were back 60 years ago. What's the biggest difference between today from 60 years ago?
I'll tell you the biggest difference is this word, as we talked earlier about bringing community together. For a company like an FFRDC, as we call it, these federally funded research development centers were constructed where that entity, in this case MITRE, would operate this thing almost in a silo. And we have the expertise, we had the knowledge, and we could create a solution to a very complex problem for government that provided value back to the public. What you see over the last 15, 20 years is the complexity of problems, and I like taking healthcare as a classic one where one organization cannot solve the problem anymore, even if it's got some of the best minds. You have to create partnerships. Creating strategic partnerships is very hard, particularly for a not-for-profit, when you're trying to create something that, how do I remain objective and independent, and I have other commercial interests who I'm partnering with, in a way to bring an answer to the government that entity doesn't somehow use that knowledge, which others do not, to their advantage, to out-compete others, for example, in the government space. It's sort of a delicate dance, and we're just trying to figure this out in terms of how does MITRE create these strategic partnerships that lets us bring a community together in a way and not violate a set of core values that we have and the government expects, to really, at the end of the day, come up with the solutions. And that's what we can't get. Sometimes we get wrapped around with the bureaucracy and on the like. We lose sight of, look, we got a problem here.
Right.
Let's all pitch in and try to solve the problem going forward.
A business analog to this would be customers don't care about your constraints.
Yeah.
We sit around the office talking about why we can't do stuff. Your customers don't care, and the citizens don't either.
Right.
We're glad that you're rising above the stovepipes, I think we call silos in the government, right? Navigating ecosystems and bringing these really hard, addressing these really hard problems. One of the things that Jason mentioned was trusted systems. I would like to think that one of our most trusted systems is the rule of law in government that we have created. It is a deeply flawed system. Some of us have been involved in it in various ways. But it reminds me of Socrates and his decision to not avoid the death sentence. He didn't commit suicide, it was self-execution. He was offered the opportunity to leave upon being sentenced to death. In fact, many people said, including the guards themselves, they would be happy to look the other way. But Socrates drank the hemlock, something that I probably wouldn't have been able to do. Socrates drank the hemlock saying, I am first and foremost a Greek, an Athenian, and I believe in our system. And if our system fails, we all fail. Thank you very much, Jason.
Thank you.